The night everything vanished. Even the clocks went silent. I woke at 2:47 a.m. to the sound of nothing, the hum of the refrigerator gone, the faint buzz of the alarm system dead. When I opened my phone, the banking app showed zeros where our savings used to glow in smug blue fonts. Every cent, every line of credit, gone, more efficiently than if a burglar had ransacked the house. That same phone blinked with a single new message, unsigned. "Sleep well, darling. You always said you trusted me." For a minute I just stared, too stunned to move. Then the meaning slammed into me with physical force. The husband I'd given 15 years of faith, the partner who'd promised, "We'll grow gray together," had drained everything and disappeared. People think betrayal sounds like shouting or breaking glass. It doesn't. It's the echo of your own breath when realization lands, and the world forgets to make noise with you. By dawn, I'd searched every drawer, every folder. The laptop he always guarded was gone. The wedding photo from the wall vanished too, a clean rectangle of unfaded paint left behind like mockery. Only the faint smell of his cologne hung in the hall, already turning from familiar to nauseating. I called the police first, then the bank, then my best friend Nora. The detective's voice was flat with procedural calm. "Ma'am, you'll need to file a formal fraud complaint." He asked if I suspected anyone. I laughed, a raw, cracked sound that startled even me. "Only the man who still has my toothbrush at hotel number unknown." The officer said gently, "I'm sorry, ma'am. These cases can take months. I didn't have days. The mortgage withdrawal had bounced. The notice sat like a stain in my inbox. I'd built my life on loyalty and deadlines, and both had expired without warning. When Nora came over, she found me sitting on the floor among open envelopes. "You look like a crime scene," she said softly. "I am one," I muttered. She helped me pick through the mess, color-coded tabs and spreadsheets glaring like sad confetti. We discovered what the detective would later confirm. He'd opened a shell company 6 months earlier, funneled our joint accounts into it, mortgaged the property, liquidated investments, and then, poof. But the cruelest wound wasn't the theft. It was the smile he'd still given me at dinner the night before. Candlelight, laughter, a toast to our next adventure. And I, fool in love, clinked his glass. For 3 days I alternated between tears and fury so pure it felt electric under my skin. Sleep abandoned me. I lived on coffee and adrenaline, rereading his last note until the words blurred into threat rather than farewell. Then came the whispers from neighbors. Pity disguised as curiosity. She must have known. How could she let that happen? Their eyes followed me to the grocery store, to the mailbox, measuring humiliation like vultures measuring distance to a carcass. I could have stayed their spectacle. But humiliation is a strange fuel. Burn it right, and it becomes power. The 4th morning after his vanishing, I stood in front of the mirror, face swollen from grief, hair unwashed, eyes rimmed in sleepless red. I whispered, "He took money. He doesn't get my name." That sentence lit something primal. I called a lawyer, the same one who'd handled our small renovations years ago. His receptionist tried to slide me into the next available slot in 3 weeks. I said, "He stole 6 figures. I'm coming in now." My voice must have carried a tone even she recognized. I had an appointment within the hour. By noon, legal wheels turned. By evening, private investigators were tracing accounts across states. But I saw clearly that chasing him required strength, not hysteria. If I confronted the world playing the victim, they'd treat me as one. I had to project command, even when my insides were falling through. So I showered, applied mascara with hands still trembling, and put on the navy blazer he had hated, the one he said made me too intimidating in meetings. Perfect. Intimidation was my new perfume. That night I wrote a list titled, "Truth to be Shown." 1. Find where he ran. 2. Expose what he did. 3. Prove everyone wrong. 4. Forgive last. The next move came from instinct, storytelling. He'd always lived by charm, reputation, and image. Destroying an image requires only truth placed under bright enough light. I began documenting everything: statements, receipts, old texts, messages that now read like confession under hindsight. I stored duplicates in cloud drives, mailed copies to Nora, even printed them out because ink felt safer than pixels. Days blurred into nights spent learning forensic accounting from online videos, tracing every wire transfer. I discovered he'd invested my money into fake property deals pitched to small-town retirees, a Ponzi scheme propped up by my credibility because I'd co-signed half the contracts without realizing. My signature was currency for his lies. The moment that truth landed, nausea turned to resolve. I'd been polite my whole life, raised to believe confrontation was unseemly. But ruin has its own etiquette. You speak louder or get buried silently. 2 weeks after the discovery, I booked a flight to the town where his fake company supposedly headquartered, a picturesque coastal place he'd described once as perfect for retirement. When my car rolled into Main Street, the irony nearly swallowed me. Every third shop displayed a shuttered sign. Gossip traveled on breeze. Faces recognized my last name before I even introduced myself. The woman at the diner counter leaned forward when she read my card. "You're his wife?" she whispered, then lowered her voice to venomous amazement. "You mean ex-wife. After what he did here, folks would chase him off with pitchforks if they could find him." She told me half the town had invested through his company, lured by easy dividends. Entire pensions gone. No wonder Main Street looked boarded up. It was his economic graveyard. I scribbled names, phone numbers, pain. That night in a budget hotel, I framed out the plan that would become my resurrection. If he'd hidden behind charm, I'd weaponize truth with the same precision. He stole money, I'd take back narrative. I'd show the town, the police, and every smug whisperer exactly who the real thief was. And I'd do it not in rage, but in sunlight so bright even their disbelief would burn away. I slept for the first time in weeks. Vengeance, when aligned with justice, can be the cleanest lullaby. If grief was a storm, publicity was lightning. I realized fast that quiet complaints die softly, while public records echo. So I started with statements, facts, not accusations. The next morning, I marched into the local newspaper office. The editor, a wiry man who smelled of ink and cynicism, barely looked up when I said, "I'm the wife of Thomas Keene." That got his attention. "We've been looking for him." I placed a USB drive on his desk. "Then today you'll have more than rumors. You'll have proof we spent 3 hours going over bank statements, witness lists, and his fake investments." The editor kept muttering, "My God, how did he keep this facade running?" "Charm," I said flatly. He weaponized politeness. By nightfall, the local paper ran a front-page teaser. "Developer's dream scheme unravels. Victims speak out." My phone melted under incoming calls. Reporters wanted quotes. Victims wanted solidarity. Acquaintances back in my old neighborhood wanted gossip. I chose my words like bullets. Factual, calm, without spite. Anger sounds unstable. Truth, when steady, terrifies liars far more. Within 48 hours, regional channels picked it up. That same evening, I received my first sign he was watching. An untraceable email. "You're embarrassing yourself. Stop before you wreck what's left of your life." I almost laughed. It was the arrogance of someone who believed silence was still a leash around my neck. Instead, I poured a glass of water, looked at the spray of nightlights outside the motel window, and said aloud, "If truth ruins my life, then it must have been built wrong." The next morning I met the victims. They gathered in the town library, A dozen faces lined with fatigue, disbelief, shame. People who'd trusted him because he had my last name beside his signature. I apologized before any lawyer could warn me not to. I didn't know, but I should have. I co-signed some papers you all invested in. I can't undo the theft, but I can drag it into daylight. A woman in her 70s, eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness, squeezed my hand. We just want someone to believe us. Then let's make them, I said. We formed a committee that afternoon, unpolished, relentless, united by outrage. I drafted legal affidavits while Nora, who'd driven down to join me, built a victims group social page and link bank information to cross-verify statements. The pressure grew faster than I expected. Anonymous tips arrived. So did slander. Online trolls called me complicit. One particularly vile comment read, "She's just mad she lost the gravy train." I printed the comment, stuck it above my laptop, and used it as a daily warm-up. Fuel disguised as insult. Weeks blurred into investigations. Detectives confirmed what we uncovered. A network of ghost accounts stretching through 3 states, all linked to him. Knowing didn't calm me. It whetted conviction. Meanwhile, the town turned from suspicion to solidarity. A coffee shop offered free refills to volunteers scanning documents. Church meetings included prayers for justice and for the brave woman who spoke first. I never asked for sainthood, only truth, but acceptance felt heavier than hatred. It carried expectation. One evening, walking back to my rental car, headlights flared behind me. Tires screeched, a rock smashed near my feet. Then darkness swallowed everything but my heartbeat. I froze, waiting for the next move. Nothing. When I bent to examine the rock, paper was taped around it. "Enough, Ellie, leave." My knees shook, but my spine didn't bend. Fear tries to negotiate. Resolve answers no. I reported the incident to police, knowing it would spark headlines. Better exposure than silence. The detective frowned. He's desperate if he's resorting to intimidation. Desperate people make mistakes, I said. Let's hope he hurries. He did. The next week, his alias appeared at an out-of-state bank cross-referenced to insurance fraud. Investigators moved, warrants followed. But what mattered to me wasn't the arrest alone, it was the narrative. I wanted the townspeople, my old neighbors, and especially every woman told to keep quiet, to see the cost of obedience versus the reward of audacity. So I accepted speaking invitations to women's groups, local radio, even a university ethics seminar. At first, my hands shook holding the microphone. But as faces lifted toward me, collective anger turned into collective power, and my voice steadied. I'm not here because I'm brave, I told them. I'm here because shame is expensive. And silence too often is sold as dignity. Applause rose like a small storm. Afterward, people lined up to talk. Young wives whispering that they feared their own finances, retirees confessing similar scams. Their stories built an invisible fortress around my loneliness. One night after an event, Nora poured wine and asked, "Have you thought about what you'll do once he's found?" "I'll stand in the courtroom," I said, "and listen while the truth speaks for itself. Then I'll walk out and start living, finally." Living as what? I don't know yet. But not as someone defined by what he took. That answer haunted me later, in good ways. By month's end, federal agents detained him in Arizona under a false identity. When the call came, I was downtown handing flyers for a victims fundraiser. My knees almost gave out from pure relief. He'd been renting a house under someone else's name, driving a luxury SUV I unknowingly bought. The trial took months to prepare. Media spun narratives. Scorned wife turns crusader. Town hero rebuilds justice. I ignored both. Titles blur, evidence endures. The night before proceedings began, I returned to the coastal boardwalk where I first planned my exposure campaign. The same battered benches, the same sea smell, now carrying a peace I hadn't felt in years. I whispered to the dark water, "Tomorrow, I don't just confront him. I confront the version of me that believed lies were love." For the first time, the sea's answer didn't sound cruel. It sounded like closure waiting just offshore. The courthouse smelled of paper and anxiety. Reporters crowded the stairs like gulls waiting for scraps, microphones angled toward my face. "Mrs. Keene, are you seeking vengeance?" one shouted. I stopped on the top step. "No," I said, "just accuracy." The quote ran everywhere by sunset. Inside, the courtroom air was cold, fluorescent, merciless. When they brought him in, I almost didn't recognize the man I'd once waited dinner for. He'd lost weight. His hair had thinned. The swagger remained, coiled tight, a snake just before strike. He avoided my eyes, lips curled in some ironic half-smile meant for the cameras. The prosecutor walked me through direct testimony first. Dates, accounts, transactions. I anchored myself to facts, not feelings. Each admission reclaimed a fragment of stolen power. When it was his lawyer's turn, he stood easily, practiced charm, ready to play victim. "Mrs. Keene," he began, "isn't it true you signed every document willingly?" "Yes," I said, "because marriage vows are built on trust, and I hadn't learned yet that mine was a lease, not a contract." The courtroom murmured. His lawyer frowned. He pressed harder, but each time I answered calmly until the rhythm of cross-examination became almost soothing. My fear shrank under the precision of truth. When my testimony ended, the judge called for recess. As I walked past him, our eyes finally met. There it was, the same smirk he'd used when apologizing for late nights, when twisting phrases until blame landed softly back on me. This time, it slipped. For just an instant, he looked small. I didn't smile. Pity isn't the same as forgiveness. Outside, cameras flashed. A journalist asked if I had anything to say to women following the trial. "Yes," I told her. "Never sign away your curiosity. It's the cheapest contract you'll ever regret." The clip went viral overnight. Messages poured in. Strangers calling me warrior, survivor, inspiration. The praise felt odd, like applause during an earthquake. Everything shaking, yet everyone cheering. But if my story could redirect one woman early enough to save herself, it was worth the noise. Over the next weeks, evidence piled like bricks in a rising wall. Bank managers testified, victims wept, spreadsheets turned to confession. The prosecution played audio of his calls coaxing investors. His voice, once so familiar, now slithered cold and professional through the speakers. I watched jurors flinch. During one recess, I slipped into an empty corridor, leaned against the cool marble, and finally let my hands tremble. Nora joined silently, passing me a thermos of tea. "He's losing," she whispered. "So am I admitted. But in a good way. I'm losing fear." When the verdict came, guilty on counts stretching long as the indictment summary, I didn't cry. The victims behind me did. Their relief filled the courtroom thicker than oxygen. As bailiffs led him away, he turned one last time. "You enjoyed this, didn't you?" he spat. I met his stare. "I endured it. There's a difference," the gavel echoed like a door shutting on our shared history. Afterward, standing in sunlight outside those tall stone pillars, someone thrust a microphone again. "What now, Mrs. Keene?" "I stopped being Mrs. Anything," I answered. "My name's Eliza Merrill again, and I have work to do." Work came swiftly. Rebuilding finances required months of legal acrobatics, but compensation funds from seized assets trickled eventually. I could have retreated, but visibility had turned into responsibility. The victims' committee expected leadership, and something in me needed purpose beyond damage control. So I set out to rebuild not my marriage name but my reputation into a platform. I registered a nonprofit, Mirror Project, focused on education around financial abuse and coercive control, terms that still made bankers uncomfortable. I wanted those words on billboards. If embarrassment could prevent exploitation, fine, let discomfort do its job. Our first seminar drew 40 people in a community center with flickering lights. Within 3 months, we had 40,000 followers online. Survivors wrote testimonials. Law students offered free research. The story had become seed again, growing far beyond what he'd tried to destroy. Still, I kept reminders close. The printed bank alerts framed near my desk. The text message, "Sleep well, darling," saved on my phone screen like a scar to touch when doubt murmured, "You're exaggerating." One evening, 6 months after the trial, I walked past a cafe television playing an interview with the lead detective. "The victim's insistence on thorough documentation was pivotal," he said. "She refused to disappear." Hearing it phrased so clinically made me smile. Refusal had become my art. But closure isn't an event, it's maintenance. Some mornings, I'd wake craving one more conversation with the man he'd been before greed hollowed him. I'd imagine him apologizing, not for theft, but for making me question my own sanity. Then reality settled. The only apology worth waiting for is the one you give yourself when you finally stop waiting. As spring rolled in, invitations poured for conferences. On one stage, a moderator asked, "What would you tell your younger self?" I paused, looked at the crowd, mostly women clutching notebooks, and said, "Love widely, but audit devotion." Trust is beautiful, accounting keeps it honest. Laughter light, but knowing swept the room. Afterward, a young man approached. "My mother's going through something similar," he said. "Can I connect you?" I took his card. The ripple kept spreading. In quieter hours, I began writing. At first, private journal entries. Soon, chapters formed. Not revenge memoir, but roadmap. How to reconstruct identity after financial betrayal. Nora teased me. "You're turning your tragedy into a tutorial." "Better than letting it rot," I replied. When the manuscript finished, I hesitated before sending it. Publishing meant permanence. But one evening, the ocean wind through my rented house whispered like an encouraging friend, and I clicked send. 3 months later, a small press offered publication, modest advance. The day the contract arrived, I read every line aloud before signing. A small ritual, reclaiming the act that once doomed me. That night, I opened a bottle of wine and toasted to quiet things: steady income, sturdy self-respect, and the delicious absence of panic. Nora raised her glass across the table. "So, truth showed the town, huh?" I nodded, count complete. "And the town showed me who I was always meant to be." Fame is a peculiar echo. It begins as survival and returns as myth. Within a year of the verdict, my story traveled farther than expected. Morning shows, podcasts, motivational events, the sort of circuits I once mocked. Everyone wanted the woman who showed the whole town the truth. What they didn't realize was how exhausting repeated survival can be. Each retelling reopened the vault a crack. I agreed to media selectively, treating each interview like engineering: control the narrative, remove sentimentality, emphasize responsibility. Yet even with caution, embellishment crept in. One glossy magazine dubbed me Justice Incarnate. That headline made me laugh and cringe in equal measure. Heroes are useful to readers, but they make poor sleepers of real people. Between appearances, I poured time into Mirror Project. We moved to proper offices downtown. Ex-investigators volunteered training programs, including one former fraudster who'd served his time and now lectured on manipulation tactics. I labeled that session Know your enemy. The irony wasn't lost on me. On an autumn afternoon, our team prepared for a fundraising gala when a courier delivered a plain envelope addressed in handwriting I instantly recognized. My pulse spiked before logic intervened. He was behind bars. Correspondence had to pass through approval channels. Still, seeing my old name written by that hand froze me. I waited until evening to open it. Eliza, it began, not Ellie. That alone disarmed me for a second. I hear they call you brave now. You always were. What I did was survival, not malice. Maybe one day you'll understand desperation. Until then, you win. 4 sentences. Neat, rehearsed, utterly tone-deaf. No apology, just vocabulary performing regret. I folded it once, twice, sealed it in an evidence envelope. Some ghosts belong archived, not exorcised. The next morning, when I mentioned the letter to Nora, she asked if I wanted to go public with it. No, I said. People already know the ending. They don't need the sequel written by a liar. But privately, the note sparked reflection on desperation, not his, mine. How close had I come to drowning quietly rather than fighting loud? How many others were doing that right now, behind neat curtains and polite smiles? The thought birthed a new arm of the foundation, an anonymous hotline for financial distress victims. Within weeks of launching, calls flooded in. I listened to recordings sometimes, the voices trembling with that same disbelief I'd lived through. It hurt, but it also healed. Empathy was the sound of my own story redistributed. One caller's message stuck. A man, mid-50s, said his partner had drained their joint venture, but he was too embarrassed to report it. You showed the town the truth, he said, but I live in the kind of town that punishes whistleblowers. I called him back myself. Then let's start punishing silence instead, I told him. That line became our next campaign slogan. The second year brought calmer winds. I finally looked for a home not defined by escape. I bought a converted warehouse near the sea, light flooding windows, white walls begging for renewal. Painting them alone one weekend, I laughed remembering my first accountant spreadsheet in that dingy motel. Growth looked less glamorous in real life. Paint under fingernails, bills organized by hope. At night, I sometimes sat on the balcony watching ships slide along the horizon. They followed invisible paths, captains trusting maps they couldn't see. I figured that's what forgiveness must feel like, navigating darkness on inherited faith that land exists somewhere ahead. News came from the prison once a year, routine updates. He'd filed appeals, none successful. The system now handled him. I no longer needed to. Detachment felt better than victory. One winter morning, however, the warden called personally. He had passed, stroke after an altercation. No next of kin listed except me. For a long time I said nothing, just watched steam rise from my untouched coffee. Finally, I whispered, "End of file." Closure rarely arrives wrapped nicely, but this felt close enough. Still, I attended the paperwork formalities, signed the final release. When asked about burial preferences, I suggested a city plot marked simply by number. Sentiment had expired. That night, I walked along the same dock where my plan for exposure was first born. Moonlight shimmered across water like a receipt for all debts paid. "You stole everything," I murmured to cold air, "but you couldn't steal who I became finding it back." Work kept expanding. Our hotline reached national level, attracting grants and political attention. Now senators quoted my lines about transparency. Success looked public again, and ironically, almost commercialized. At first, popularity felt infectious. Then, it felt like pressure. When every movement is admired, room for error disappears. So I retreated into writing again. My second book, Town of Truth, wasn't memoir, but collective anthology. Stories of other survivors, my voice just stitching them together. One reviewer called it a guidebook for moral infrastructure. I liked that phrase. Integrity has architecture. At the launch event, packed hall, applause thick as humidity, I froze mid-speech, faces blurred into a watercolor sea. For a heartbeat, I remembered being broke, terrified, huddled in that cheap motel chair glare reading financial terms till sunrise. The two versions of me collided, one in ashes, one in spotlight, and for the first time, they shook hands. When applause ended, I stepped off stage, finding Nora waiting by the curtain. "You finally look peaceful," she said. "I think peace just means the absence of argument between who you were and who you are," I answered. Outside, drizzle streaked the city lights. I pulled my coat tighter and walked without umbrella, letting rain paint the final wash of that long chapter. Somewhere between street lamps, I smiled at the absurd thought that rain was just heaven cooling down sparks from the fires I'd survived. After the book launch, life took on the stillness that follows a long performance. Applause fades, stage dust settles, and you stand blinking in a quiet you've forgotten how to breathe. The foundation ran smoothly under new directors. The hotline operated 24 hours without me checking every statistic. For the first time in years, there were no emergencies, no statements to draft, no interviews. Rest, people said. As if rest were a skill. I tried. Mornings on the balcony, barefoot walks on wet sand, tea gone cold because my mind kept wandering to tasks that didn't exist anymore. Productivity had become my therapy. Stopping felt like withdrawal. One afternoon, while cleaning old boxes from storage, I found a photograph I hadn't seen in years. Me and him, the day we bought our first house, our smiles too wide for our faces. Instead of rage, I felt curiosity. Who were those people, believing forever meant protection? I traced the memory with a fingertip, then slipped the photo into a drawer I now treat as an archive, not a shrine. The difference is subtle but life-saving. Weeks later, an email arrived from a university inviting me to teach a short seminar on narrative accountability, how storytelling changes public response to fraud and abuse. Academic world, the very one that once side-eyed my small-town scandal, now sought my syllabus. I accepted, secretly thrilled. Teaching meant structure, and structure I understood. Standing in front of students half my age, I saw not naivety, but hunger for truth uncloaked by cynicism. We debated ethical storytelling. We disassembled headlines that make villains fascinating and survivors palatable. I told them, justice isn't a good story until someone bleeds words into it. I did. That's the cost of clarity. Their silence afterward was reverent and heavy. Several queued later just to thank me for honesty. I walked home under orange campus lamps feeling strangely light, like the universe had finally bartered equilibrium for endurance. Meanwhile, Amir, the media consultant who'd helped polish my public talks, became a quiet fixture in my later days. Friendship ripened into companionship that crept gently, without fanfare. He never promised repair, only company, which is the healthiest promise anyone can make. One evening, over dinner by the pier, he said, "You've spent years proving the truth. What happens when proof isn't needed anymore?" I stared at the water strobing with neon reflections. "Then maybe I'll learn to tell stories that don't hurt." He smiled. "That might be the bravest chapter yet." It was, because gentleness, after years of battle, felt like new muscle forming over scars. The house near the sea slowly turned into home. I painted the living room a soft eggshell blue, filled shelves with mismatched books and seashells. No trophies, no framed interviews, nothing commemorating pain disguised as pride. If visitors asked, "Where's your award wall?" I'd point to the window. "Outside," I'd say, "everything I built is breathing, not framed." One humid morning, power flickered. My instinct, absurd but instant, was panic. Memories of that first night with vanished numbers. But the electricity returned a second later, and the irony hit me. I no longer worried about accounts emptying without warning. Freedom wasn't wealth, it was waking up unafraid of vanishing. With the class finished, the foundation autonomous, and storms finally at bay, I spent days writing again, smaller things, essays, meditations. I found joy in details I'd once rushed past, the hiss of iron on linen, the way coffee curled steam into sunlight. Normal life, once a luxury, became an art form. One late afternoon while browsing a flea market, I met an old man selling handmade sculptures of birds. I asked what inspired him. "They always return home," he said, "no matter how far they wander." I bought a small wooden swallow and placed it on my desk, a totem for resilience returning to itself. Months drifted like gentle tides. Then one night, the town where it all began invited me back for a civic ceremony, unveiling a community center funded partly by victim restitution. They wanted me to cut the ribbon. For several minutes I stared at the email, unsure if facing those streets again would reopen ghosts or finally dismiss them. The next weekend I drove back, the same coastal road, now widened and lined with new shops. The diner still stood, windows cleaner, laughter louder. When I stepped inside, the waitress squinted, then broke into delighted surprise. "Well, if it isn't the lady who turned our misery into miracles," I laughed. "How's business?" "Better than hope," she said, gesturing toward bustling tables. "You gave us our town back." Her gratitude warmed like sunrise inside my chest. During the ceremony, the mayor spoke politely about resilience and turning adversity into civic growth. I barely listened. My gaze stayed on the crowd, faces once hollowed by betrayal, now alive with ordinary contentment. That was the real speech. After the ribbon cut, I wandered to the end of Main Street where the old company office still stood, shuttered long ago. Someone had turned it into a bakery. Through the glass, I saw a young couple decorating pastries, dusting sugar onto croissants. Life renovating decay. It felt poetic, appropriate, final. I bought one croissant, sat on a bench, and let flakes fall onto my lap as gulls squabbled overhead. The smell of butter and salt carried me backward and forward at once, grieving not the past, but how completely I'd outgrown it. When I rose, the afternoon sky turned a mellow rose gold. I whispered softly, "Town, you saw the truth. Keep it." Driving home, I felt no lingering cinematics, no triumph music, just content simplicity, the kind of ending that isn't spectacular, only sincere. At night, back on my balcony, I opened my journal. Sometimes victory isn't showing the world the truth. It's living so honestly afterward that no one can steal it again. I closed the cover and watched the horizon fade, knowing the story others would quote is only half of one. The other half is this quiet, ordinary afterglow where truth finally needed no audience. The following spring arrived perfumed with salt and jasmine, and I learned that endings are not permanent, but recurring punctuation marks. We pause, we breathe, and we continue. It started with a letter from a publishing house proposing to adapt my books as a limited television drama. My first instinct was recoil. Fictionalizing my past felt like letting strangers repaint a memory I'd spent years restoring. Yet part of me knew, stories survive better when they evolve. I agreed only after writing one clause in bold. Creative supervision remains mine. Signing that paper felt different this time. Steady heartbeat, eyes clear, no illusions about anyone's promises but my own signature. The production unfolded surprisingly gently. Actors asked questions with kindness. They wanted to know how betrayal actually sounds, how freedom smells. I told them, like silence before sunrise, when you realize you're accountable solely to your own breath. Those words ended up in the script's closing monologue. When filming wrapped months later, the director asked if I wanted to cameo. I declined. I played the role once. It nearly killed me, I said. Someone else can do the reenactment. The premiere became another circus. Flashing lights, red carpet, all that bright, superficial glitter. Reporters asked whether seeing someone play me reeled open pain. No, I answered truthfully. It shows how far pain travels to become art. Amir stood beside me, proud smile subtle, grounded. When the theater dimmed and the first scene played, me, a character now, waking to stolen zeros on a bank screen, I felt nothing except compassion for that fictional woman. The audience gasped, cried, applauded. I clapped quietly with them, one tear sliding down, not of grief or vanity, but awe. I had turned surviving into storytelling powerful enough to hire actresses. Afterward, in the lobby glow, a teenage girl approached, hesitant. "My dad drained my college fund," she whispered. "Everyone says I should forgive." Watching your story, I understood forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. I hugged her, careful not to break composure. "Exactly," I said. "You forgive to stop the bleeding, not to invite another cut." Moments like that reminded me that the truth I'd shown wasn't confined to one town anymore. It had become multilingual, generational. As the series spread internationally, responses flooded from places I'd never been: fishermen's communities, suburban book clubs, even financial institutions inviting workshops. It was surreal. The woman labeled foolish hosting ethics seminars for global banks. I almost wished my younger self could peek around Times Corner and laugh, yet I guarded solitude tightly. Each weekend I vanished from noise, driving out to coastal cliffs where phone signals failed. There, I'd picnic with Amir under seabird cries, reading to each other in alternating paragraphs from whatever novel we carried. He once quoted, "Resilience is love's quieter twin." I added, "And both need good weather occasionally." We toasted to that truth with thermos coffee and laughter. Back in the city, responsibilities morphed again. The foundation branched into youth education, teaching financial literacy in schools. On one chalkboard lesson, a 9-year-old asked, "Why do people lie with money?" I replied, "Because numbers look safer than feelings until both collapse." She scribbled that down seriously, and I thought, if wisdom can start that young, maybe the cycle finally breaks. Through it all, I kept writing, not for fame, but habit. Pages filled with hybrid reflections, half poem, half lecture, musings on trust, ambition, redemption. A literary journal picked a few essays, calling them The Anatomy of Aftermath. They compared me to philosophers I'd barely read. I smiled at the irony. I'd once been a bookkeeper's wife, not a thinker by trade. Now people footnoted my scars. Occasionally, nightmares visited, scenes where bank accounts evaporated again, or I saw him smiling with that same note pinned to my pillow. But waking, the fear dissolved fast. Healing isn't never remembering, it's remembering without trembling. One wild storm night, power flickered off just as thunder shook the horizon. Amir lit candles, half playful, half protective. We sat on the floor eating toast, laughing at shadows of our own faces dancing on walls. "Some storm," he said. "I used to panic at darkness," I admitted. "Now I see it as proof the light's working somewhere." Wind slammed windows but couldn't invade the calm between our heartbeats. The world could flicker all it chose. We'd learned our own voltage. When dawn returned golden and calm, I stepped outside barefoot onto wet decking, breathing petrichor and salt. The air felt new, like cleared memory. I whispered to the sea, "Do what you must. I can rebuild again." Not a challenge, just confirmation of faith in my own elasticity. Months later, we traveled for the Foundation's 10th year anniversary, a convention hall full of survivors transformed into leaders. On stage, I asked someone else, a former victim turned director, to give the keynote. I watched from the audience this time, clapping among them, finally no longer the symbol, just part of a continuum. That shift, crowd instead of center, was liberation's last test passed. After the applause died down, she sought me out. "I owe you my strength," she said. "No," I said gently. You borrowed it until yours grew back. Now lend it onward. That night, I sat on the balcony of the hotel, lights from the harbor blinking like Morse code. My reflection in the window looked serene, lines deepened but softened. Perhaps age isn't wear, but evidence of having been fully alive. I closed my notebook, scribbling one sentence before sleep. Revenge built walls. Truth built doors. I choose doors. The next years blurred softly into a pattern of living rather than surviving. I still spoke at events, but less out of duty, and more because I enjoyed connecting, like comparing constellations of experience across skeptical faces. In one keynote somewhere in Lisbon, I realized mid-sentence that I no longer clenched my hands when saying betrayal. The word had lost its ability to bruise. After the session, an elderly man in a tweed cap approached. "You taught us that truth and mercy can be neighbors," he said. I smiled. It was strange. Once I thought justice and mercy could never share the same house. Now they sometimes cooked breakfast together. At home, Amir and I restored the old beach cottage into an artist's retreat. Painters, poets, and activists cycled through, each paying with a promise to mentor someone else. We called it the Lighthouse Project. The first group painted murals of waves on the exterior walls, bold blue arcs wrapping the building as if the sea itself wanted to stay ashore a little while. The sight made me grin every morning. Life turned quiet around the edges. I'd host morning talks for residents, offering tea and admonitions disguised as humor. Don't paint to prove worth. Paint to see your soul's color balance. Laughter echoed through halls thick with turpentine and hope. Yet even in peace, reflection persisted. One windy afternoon, I opened an email from an international bank asking me to join their ethics committee. They wanted the transparency icon herself on record. Amir laughed when he saw my doubtful face. "You? The woman who demolished corporate courtesy with truth? Perfect fit." "I'm not sure they'll like honesty from the inside," I said. "Then they shouldn't have invited you." I accepted, curious. That boardroom world, once intimidating, now felt miniature. During meetings, suits traded jargon. I listened, then punctured fog with plain speech. If your policies need translation to sound moral, I'd say, they probably aren't. At first, silence followed such comments. Eventually, respect. By year's end, they adopted half my reforms. That victory felt quieter, more adult. No headlines, no applause, just the subtle pleasure of systems adjusting toward integrity. Between those obligations, I wrote again, this time fiction under a pen name. Not about betrayal, about ordinary courage. Teachers, nurses, fishermen. Simple people still telling the truth in small rooms without microphones. The first novel sold modestly, but received letters more intimate than reviews. One reader wrote, "Your characters help me forgive my father." That single sentence outweighed every award. At 60, I learned to nap again, to dance in kitchens, to leave some days wholly unplanned. One evening, blue dusk glowed through lace curtains when Amir asked if I ever missed the intensity, the interviews, cameras, trials. I considered it. No, drama was expensive rent for attention. Peace is cheaper real estate. He laughed so loudly we frightened a gull off the balcony. But not all memory faded kindly. That winter, a package arrived with no return address. Inside lay the old USB drive, the same one I'd first handed to the journalist years ago, with a note, "Find whatever truth remains." It could have been symbolic, but curiosity tugged. Plugging it in, I discovered archived photos, project sites, interviews, victim stories. Somehow the paper had digitized their behind-the-scenes footage and returned it as artifact. Watching those raw images, I saw the younger me again, trembling but set like sailcloth against storm wind. "Look at her hair," Amir teased gently from behind my shoulder. "Look at her nerve," I corrected. She never knew what came next, yet she kept moving forward. He kissed the top of my head. Still does. That night I couldn't sleep. The footage haunted in a strangely comforting way, as if, across time, I was giving myself permission to rest now because she had done enough fight then. The next morning I walked the shoreline early. Oyster shells cracked underfoot, clouds layering stripes across sky and sea. In my pocket I carried the USB, and at the cliff edge I tossed it into waves, not in hatred, not in ritual, just as release. Let the story belong to currents now. Days continued. The lighthouse gained reputation as a refuge for those between stories, grieving artists, retired truth seekers, wanderers learning to be still. I sometimes sat with them at sunset circles, listening more than speaking. Healing travels better when passed hand to hand, not broadcast. One evening, a young sculptor asked, "What if truth ruins everything?" "Families, reputations, income." I answered, "Then it ruins what was false. What's real will rebuild around the crater, stronger." She nodded slowly. The sea kept rhythm behind us, affirming in its endless repetition, destroy, rebuild, destroy, rebuild. Every so often, new journalists requested retrospectives 10 years after the scandal. I declined each politely. The town, thriving, didn't need revisiting. The people had their new histories now. I wanted them remembered for progress, not pain. Instead, I focused on a smaller personal challenge, teaching myself oil painting. The first canvas, a horizon smeared in uncertain blue, made me laugh. So unsteady. But learning replaced ego with wonder. I dedicated one wall of the cottage to unfinished works, proof that imperfection could be permanent decor. When summer rolled in, our graduates organized a festival on the beach, open mic, art sales, sea shanties. During twilight, they surprised me with a mural unveiled on the sea wall, my silhouette surrounded by upward-soaring gulls, captioned in bold paint, "She showed the town the truth." For a second, the world spun too light. Tears came without sadness, like gratitude spilling under pressure. Later, standing before that mural, Amir whispered, "What do you see?" "My story escaping me," I said, finally free. Autumn again, the kind painted in bronze light and long shadows, and I've started measuring life not in years since betrayal, but in seasons of peace. The mural now bleaches slowly under salt wind, gull feathers brushing its surface. Even legends fade naturally, and that feels right. Every once in a while, a visitor takes a photo, posts it online with a caption about courage without realizing the woman in the picture sometimes shops in line beside them buying oranges. It's become a private joke between Amir and me. Icon incognito, he teases when strangers pass without recognition. I smile. Once I would have needed acknowledgement to prove existence. Now invisibility feels like luxury linens, soft, protective, undeserved, yet warmly accepted. We live slower. Mornings devoted to garden herbs, afternoons to reading and mentoring by request only. When letters arrive from those still in battle, victims fighting courts, families fractured by lies, I read them aloud on the porch. Then I answer carefully, handwritten, not typed. Pens slow truth to a speed your heart can follow. One young mother wrote, "I can't bring myself to expose his fraud. I still love him." My reply, "Love doesn't cancel accountability, it demands it." Another wrote she feels ashamed to fight publicly. I told her, "Shame is the thief's final weapon. Take it back and he's defenseless." Sometimes the mailbox feels like triage, souls arriving for quick bandaging. But these correspondences remind me the work never finishes. It changes costume. That knowledge comforts and saddens simultaneously, like watching the sea claim back grains of the beach you built, but knowing that's balance. When the equinox storm hit, tearing half the garden fence, we huddled inside with candles. I watched rain stripe down glass thicker than tears used to fall, and found myself whispering thanks. Not for the storm, but for recognition of it as weather, not omen. Amir listened, smiling. "You still narrate everything," he said. "Habit," I confessed. "You never know who might need the script." The storm passed, sunlight breaking through like applause. In its wake came the smell of renewal, wet earth and possibility. I stepped outside barefoot and whispered, "Still standing." The phrase felt playful now, not defiant. A few months later, an invitation arrived from the very courthouse where my rebuilding had started. They planned a symposium on restorative justice and wanted my closing address. I hesitated for a week. Returning felt circular, almost theatrical. But maybe circles are the architecture of closure. On the appointed day, dressed in gray silk, hair streaked silver like honest weathering, I walked those same marble corridors. Reporters recognized me but gave respectful distance this time. Inside the main chamber, everything smelled of polish and restrained anticipation. When my turn came, I stood behind the podium and let silence settle until even the air listened. "I was asked to speak about truth," I began, "but that word is too heavy to carry alone. Truth needs companions, courage, documentation, patience, and sometimes microphones. It cost me everything once because I trusted it would pay back eventually. It did, just not in currency I expected." Laughter rose soft and sympathetic. I continued. "The goal of justice isn't punishment. It's prevention. If my former life taught anything, let it be that transparency before crisis is cheaper than vengeance after it." When applause filled the chamber, I saw faces both new and familiar. Lawyers, young activists, quiet janitorial staff leaning against doors listening. For each, the story meant something unique. For me, it meant peace with the echo. Afterward, crossing the courtyard, a clerk handed me a sealed envelope from the archives department. Inside was an official notice. Case number 4187 closed. Restitution dispersed. Record sealed. 3 bureaucratic lines that took a decade of living. I folded the letter, feeling neither triumph nor grief, only equilibrium. Outside, the town's skyline shimmered in early evening gold. Buildings renovated, the bakery thriving, children chasing pigeons near the fountain. Life resumed without my supervision, which was the true victory. I bought a loaf of bread and shared it with those pigeons, laughing softly as they fought for crumbs. Maybe survival is just learning to feed the world from your leftover pieces. Driving home along the familiar coast road, I rolled down the window and let air whip through my hair. A memory flashed. That first terrified journey years ago to this very town, heart in pieces, bank accounts hollow. Now the same road hummed beneath new tires, same sea but friendlier. Redemption sometimes sounds exactly like your own car engine running smoothly. At home, Amir waited with tea, lanterns glowing. We sat on the deck watching the final copper light fade. I told him about the symposium letter, the sealed record. He raised his cup. "To closure," he toasted. "To continuation," I corrected, tapping mine against his. Later, when night rested fully on the sea, I slipped upstairs to write. Old habit, ever faithful. The journal pages filled under my pen. He stole everything from me once. Money, certainty, and naive faith in forever. But when I showed the whole town the truth, I found an inventory he couldn't touch. Intellect, voice, endurance. Those I kept. Those multiplied. I paused, listening to waves break their eternal dialogue with shore. Beyond the open window, lighthouse beams swept slow rotations, steady as breathing. I whispered to their rhythm, half prayer, half proclamation. I forgive the theft. Without it, I might never have counted what was truly mine. The wind carried back the faintest echo, like laughter. Mine, maybe the sea's. I closed the journal, turned off the lamp, and let darkness lie gently across the room.